So, the Metal Gear games are often considered some of the most important games of all time and are even frequently considered to still be some of the greatest games ever made. And despite this, I've never played them. And recently, when I asked you guys what games you would like to see me review on the channel, Metal Gear was one of the very top picks, so I figured with the Master Collection having just come out, and with Metal Gear Solid 3 getting a remake soon, now would be the perfect time to get around to them. Well, actually, 10 years ago probably would have been the perfect time, but now works, I guess. So how did Metal Gear go about establishing what would become one of the most successful franchises in the gaming industry, and how does it hold up today? Well, let's talk about it. Metal Gear is an action-adventure stealth game developed and published by Konami in 1987 for the MSX2. And before talking about any of the Metal Gear games properly, we need to talk about this man right here, Hideo Kojima. Kojima is regarded as the first proper auteur in the games industry. If you're not familiar with the term auteur, it's a French filmmaking term that describes an artist with such a distinct approach, whose control over the process of creating a film is so unbounded and personal that the director is often likened to be the author of the film. This describes Kojima perfectly, and you'll come to find that the story of the history of the Metal Gear franchise is also kind of the story of Hideo Kojima himself. He's worked on many games over the years, but Metal Gear was his first ever project as a game designer and a director, so like I said, the story of Metal Gear is basically the story of Kojima in a lot of ways. And he's also a really big film nerd. I mean, just go look at the dude's Twitter, Jesus Christ. But with that context out of the way, in Metal Gear we play as Solid Snake, a rookie of an elite Black Ops unit known as Foxhound. The year is 1995, and we're sent into the mercenary nation of Outer Heaven to rescue a veteran member of Foxhound, Gray Fox, from the local militia. And due to Kojima's love of film, the story was a major priority in the development of Metal Gear, meaning that we're going to need to talk about it more than I normally would throughout the video. But getting back into the gameplay, they immediately introduce the communications system to you. For the entirety of the game, the player has access to their codec, which can send and receive communications from other members of Foxhound for support. But what's interesting is there isn't any sort of list that you choose who you want to dial from. Instead, you'll have to take note of who communicates on what frequency and enter the dial into that frequency manually to reach them. This, along with other parts of the game we'll get to, make it advisable to play Metal Gear with a pen and paper approach. And by that, I mean you quite literally write down important information as you go, since it will be incredibly useful later on and you're likely to forget it otherwise. The codec has become somewhat of a tradition in these games, and it's incredibly iconic to anyone who's ever played one of these games, so I was very pleasantly surprised to see it appear right from the very beginning of the very first game. Then when you start actually playing the game, you'll realize that while Metal Gear may look like other action games of the time, this is a stealth game first and foremost. You'll need to sneak around or quietly eliminate the guards to avoid raising the alert, as once a single guard becomes aware of your presence, any other guards in the immediate area will also be notified and start gunning straight for you. The enemy AI can see whatever's directly in front of them, but that leads to the first problem with the stealth in this game. Since they can only see directly in front of themselves, they can also only see in the 4 cardinal directions. This makes it incredibly easy to just sidestep around them, and on top of this, they have some of the wildest tunnel vision you will ever see in a stealth game, as if you're even a tile off to the side of their direct line of sight, they'll be completely oblivious to the fact that you're even there. This allows you to get in close without them noticing you incredibly easily and use your punches or a suppressed weapon to take them out without anyone being alerted. All things considered, the stealth is actually really enjoyable, and I don't want people to get the impression that I didn't enjoy it, especially since this would have been incredibly refreshing for PC gamers at the time. But it's definitely a product of its time, and you shouldn't go in expecting to be blown away by the depth of the stealth mechanics here. Along with the stealth mechanics, the core gameplay loop of Metal Gear heavily revolves around exploration. The Outer Heaven base that you'll be exploring in this game has 3 different buildings, all with a handful of floors to explore, and each of these floors end up being their own small maps full of enemies, items, bosses, and more. And along with Gray Fox, you'll be primarily searching the base to free hostages. Freeing hostages will not only get you tips and bits of info about gameplay mechanics or Outer Heaven itself, but will also contribute to your class rank. The higher your class is, the higher your maximum amount of health becomes, as well as your carrying capacity for ammunition and healing items. So it ends up being super rewarding to find as many hostages as possible during your time here, as finding more of them quite literally levels up your character as you play. On top of that, exploring will end up getting you things like new weapons, healing items, pieces of gear that will allow you to progress through certain obstacles, and most importantly of all, keycards. Keycards will allow you to get through certain doors that you previously wouldn't have had the clearance for, and these come in 8 different levels throughout the game. This ends up forming a pretty addictive loop, as you need to find keycards to access new areas, then you'll need to find a new gadget to progress through that area, then using that gadget will end up earning you another keycard, and you can start to see where the satisfaction comes in. The only downside to this system has nothing to do with the overarching game design, but rather the implementation of it. Due to the way that the inventory system functions in this game, you'll need to be holding the exact keycard to open the door that requires it, meaning that if you're trying to open a level 2 door, the level 4 card won't work, you'll need to use exactly the level 2 keycard. And since there are 8 different keycards, you'll often sit there cycling through up to all 8 of them like you're trying to find the right key on your ring. Obviously, hindsight is 2020, and having higher level keycards be able to access lower level doors would have gone a long way in terms of quality of life. Not to say that scripting that sort of thing into the game wasn't possible back in '87, because it absolutely was, but game design was very primitive back then, and quality of life wasn't really a priority at the time. The exploration in general is shockingly well paced though. At the end of my first 30 minutes with the game, I had already found 2 keycards, a gas mask, a pistol, a suppressor for that pistol, and a grenade launcher. You're constantly finding new things as you play the game, and it really goes a long way in making it feel like your time spent with it is meaningful. And early on, I realized that items in this game can be farmed incredibly easily. For example, if there's a health item in a room, farming it is as simple as picking it up, leaving the room, going back in, and grabbing it again. To add on to this, if you die enough times on the same checkpoint, the game will actually respawn you with your max carrying capacity of healing items. Not that I would know anything about that, of course. At first, I thought that this would be a big downside since I fully expected it to break the balance of the game, but this problem just never came up. The game feels like it's been balanced around the knowledge that players not only could, but would farm items like this, and while it's not all that exciting to run in and out of a room for a full minute when you find heals or ammo, it does end up making the game experience a lot smoother. It also makes it so that learning where item pickups are is vital to your success, which leads to you getting even more familiar with the base as you explore it. And before moving on, I have to give a shout out to one item in particular: the cardboard box. Nowadays, the cardboard box is an iconic Metal Gear item, but for those not familiar, it is quite literally a cardboard box that Snake flips upside down and hides under, and as long as you aren't moving while you're under it, guards and cameras alike will be completely oblivious to the fact that you're sitting right in front of them. I personally love when silly stuff like this gets put into games that otherwise try to maintain some sort of realism, so I really loved using this little box. But then there are the parts of the gameplay loop that really show their age. First of which being the combat. In the event that you're spotted, enemies will start pouring out from whatever entrance is possible and spraying bullets towards you. The enemies are pretty deadly and they really do swarm you most of the time. The reason it feels so dated is that you can only fire in the 4 cardinal directions, but enemies don't suffer from that same disadvantage, being able to fire diagonally at you, which again, makes perfect sense considering when the game came out, but it still feels clunky to play when you play it for the first time nowadays. I'm not going to complain about the combat too much though, as this is a stealth game, so avoiding combat entirely is kind of the point. Along with the combat, something that really exemplifies what era of gaming this is from are the secret rooms. Early on in the game, you'll be taught that every once in a while, there might be something hidden behind an otherwise unsuspecting wall. You can punch walls to check if they're hollow, and if they are, you can use a plastic explosive to blow it open, revealing a secret. I love the idea behind having secrets like this hidden throughout the game, but I'm not as big of a fan of how they actually used it here. See, there are a handful of secrets in Metal Gear that are completely mandatory for completing the game, meaning that if you get really stuck in this game, oftentimes the solution is to go around punching every wall in sight, hoping you might find a spot where it's hollow. I love secrets like this, I just don't think that they should be completely mandatory to progress the game, as it's really frustrating and tedious when you try to play through this game without looking up a walkthrough like I did. But that also brings us to a high point of the game. Metal Gear is a game that respects the player's intelligence in a way that most games just don't. It's perfectly comfortable to just give you an objective to seek out, and then leave the process of finding it completely up to you. It doesn't flat out tell you how to do things in the game, rather it just gives you very broad tips that give just enough to figure it out for yourself, and it leads to a very satisfying experience. Not to say that it works well 100% of the time, with the aforementioned secrets, as well as some mechanics just not being hinted at whatsoever that honestly should be, but when it works, it really goes a long way in making this game rewarding to play. The game ends up feeling like it's ultimately just a giant puzzle to be solved, and I encourage that if any of you watching haven't played before and it seems like you might want to, do so without a walkthrough, at least as much as possible. It makes the story so much more special to experience as well. Something that surprised me a lot was that I actually found Gray Fox after only a little more than an hour of gameplay, but while I was freeing him, he informed me that Outer Heaven had a weapon of mass destruction, Metal Gear.
He said it!
Metal Gear is a mobile tank equipped to launch nuclear warheads, meaning that using Metal Gear, the militia of Outer Heaven was capable of launching nukes from anywhere on the globe. He then tells me that the creator of Metal Gear, Dr. Drago Petrovich Madnar, was also being held captive and was being forced to work on the weapon. So suddenly the objective of the game changes from freeing one hostage operative to preventing Outer Heaven from being able to use the most destructive weapon ever created by man. And something that I just wasn't expecting from Metal Gear was the amount of boss fights in this game. During your time in Outer Heaven, you'll end up coming across a total of 10 unique boss fights, and the majority of these boss fights are less than stellar, but they all have a unique personality and their own unique gimmicks that change the way that you deal with them. Another thing that I found is that a lot of the time, the bosses will take almost as much ammo as you can carry at that point in the game, so they also act as a check to make sure the player has freed enough hostages and progressed far enough to be able to continue with the main plot. And I didn't find any of them to be all that challenging outside of a couple of bosses near the end, so they also thankfully avoid that common problem of boss fights from this era of gaming just being completely unfair. But then there's the largest way that Metal Gear shows its age, and it's the padding. Games from this era are notorious nowadays for being much harder than they need to be, or being way too difficult to figure out in order to stretch a 3-hour game into a 5-hour game, and unfortunately, Metal Gear is no exception to this. And it really sucks because, like I said earlier, the first half of the game is paced so fantastically, but at about that halfway point, it just suddenly pulls a complete 180. To start, when we finally find Dr. Madnar, it turns out to be just a double that was setting a trap for us, and the floor suddenly falls out from under us. If you die here, which most players likely will, you need to replay getting to the fake Dr. Madnar, but even if you escape the room when it happens, you still have to continue exploring to find the real one. Then, when you do eventually find him, he tells Snake that he won't cooperate whatsoever unless you also free his daughter, Ellen Madnar, so you now need to go and explore even more of the base to find her, with her eventually being found in the basement of an entirely different building. And once you find her, there is a shortcut back to the building with Dr. Madnar in it, but it's a tunnel where there are an insane amount of floor traps, and the amount of times I died trying to use it ultimately means I would have been better off just going the long way again. But once you get to Dr. Madnar, he tells you that Metal Gear has one weakness, and it's explosives being planted on its legs where the armor is the weakest. But of course, there's still a catch. Metal Gear can only be destroyed if you plant the bombs on each leg in a specific sequence, because that makes sense. So I wrote down the 15 bomb long sequence and went off to find Metal Gear. Before long, I realized that I need to find a higher level keycard, and I'm told that it's being held by a twin pair of humanoid cyborgs that are immune to weapons fire. So, you wanna guess how you're supposed to get it? Well, if you step into the room just to the right of these two and use your codec, then here and only here will you be able to contact a member of the Resistance who will send a rocket launcher for you to destroy them with. And the thing that confuses me with this one is why did it need to be so specific? Surely they would have achieved the same result in terms of player experience if you could have just called this Resistance member from anywhere in the game, so why is there only one room in the entire base that she can be contacted from? But anyway, I used the rocket launcher to get the keycard from them, then head to the building that Metal Gear is being stored in, and when I'm outside, I'm ambushed by a large number of guards. So Big Boss, the leader of Foxhound, reaches out to me via codec and tells me to hop into the truck on the far right. So I do what he says, and the truck moves. When I leave the truck, I'm back at the start of the game. Again. Why? I backtrack all the way to the building again, and as soon as I enter it this time, Big Boss radios again telling me to enter into the room on my left. So I do so, a little more hesitant this time than the last, and suddenly the floor falls out from under me. So at this point, I'm completely ignoring Big Boss. Got it. And along the way to the 100th level of the basement where Metal Gear is being stored, there are so many rooms that exist just to deal unavoidable damage to Snake and drain all the player's healing items before the final fight. These include rooms with poison gas that drain your health by making you cycle through your keycards to get through the doors, a room with an electrified floor with no way of disabling it, requiring you to just run through and use all of your healing items to survive, and more stuff like that. It's just the most clear attempt at making the final boss feel more difficult than it really is by burning your healing items before you even get to it, and it's a real shame because, again, nothing up to this point in the game feels unfair like this. But along the way through this final gauntlet, I find one last hostage that drops a bomb on me. The leader of Outer Heaven turns out to be Big Boss. So this means that the earlier tricks from Big Boss were just because he was trying to prevent me from destroying Metal Gear once he realized that I actually stood a chance of reaching it. This makes a couple of those time wasters from earlier a little easier to forgive, but I still feel like you could have built up to this twist in ways that don't involve wasting 20 minutes of the game's runtime. Anyway, I get into the Metal Gear fight, and I start planting plastic explosives on the feet in order. But then I get to the end, and I remember the most important detail. Dr. Madnar mentioned that it was a 16 bomb sequence, but the one he gave me was only 15. So I guess the left foot, since the one before was on the right, and it does nothing. I scramble for the right foot and I plant it while just barely surviving the fight. And as soon as I think I've done it, the self-destruct sequence for the facility starts and I need to make a mad dash to escape. But before I can, I'm confronted by one more boss fight. This time, it's Big Boss himself looking to kill me before I can escape. I managed to cheese my way through the fight with my tiny amount of health by using the rocket launcher and baiting the AI, and then it's finally over. Overall, my feelings for Metal Gear are very mixed. The game is honestly brilliant and so far ahead of its time in the first half, but then the second half completely devolves and is just as bad, if not worse than the average game from the time in terms of artificial difficulty and padding. And the story is really fun for what it is, especially since it's such an accomplishment to even have a story with this amount of depth in this era of gaming. It's a solid start to the franchise and surprisingly competent for its time, but it just hasn't aged all that well. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Metal Gear a 6.3. But what do you guys think? Those of you that have played the game, those of you learning about it for the first time through this video, let me know in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a subscription, anything to let me and the algorithm know that you did enjoy. It helps me out a lot, so I'd really appreciate it. And if you're interested in supporting the channel financially, consider checking out becoming a channel member or a patron. They start as low as $1 a month and can get you things like behind the scenes updates, early video access, and more. But if you can't afford to, don't worry about it. We've all been there, and your likes, comments, etc. already help out the videos plenty. And hey, I don't have any other Metal Gear content to offer just yet, but I did recently start a similar series reviewing the Ace Combat games, so if you liked this video, you might enjoy those. If you're interested, I'll throw the link right here on screen.